Haters and gentle friends, hello and welcome to That Final Girl Life. It's your new favourite final girl here, taking you through the horrors and out the other side to find out what life is really like after the movie ends. I can't believe I need to say this, but apparently it's a whole thing now. I am an actual real live human being, not an AI. I physically write all my scripts, I watch the movies at least twice before I do an episode on them. Any resources I use, like other people's articles which I found helpful, will be in the show notes. Now that's out of the way, since this is the first episode, here's a little bit about me. I call myself an IRL final girl because I have survived many of the horrible things shown in horror films. Somehow I still enjoy watching them, mostly I think because I find them relatable, and therefore oddly comforting. I managed to survive a childhood which involved being trafficked in 2 separate child sex rings whilst also being raised in a cult. Don't worry, I won't be talking about that in detail on this podcast, but if you're interested, I'll share where else you can find me later on. People often congratulate me for surviving and use words like brave and inspirational, especially now that my disabilities are more visible. And I am proud that I got out and managed to make a pretty good life for myself overall. But what most people don't realise about us final girls is that for us, the horrors don't end along with the initial events. I'm trained as a psychotherapist and I specialised in working with people who have survived childhood trauma. I also have a background in academic psychology, and I'm currently doing a PhD in philosophy, which is partly about the uncanny and how it's depicted in horror films. My thesis also looks at how the most difficult things that can happen to us can give us interesting and different perspectives on life, something a lot of final girls have in common. So I'll be taking us through a different horror movie in each episode, giving a brief synopsis, and then discussing what life might be like for the final girl from that story after the movie is over. I'll be using my training in psychology and psychotherapy, my experience as a therapist, and my research as a student of existential philosophy to inform what I'm saying. And of course, I'll be drawing on my own personal experiences too. There won't be any ads on here because I hate them. Before I begin this first episode though, I'd like to shout out 3 things that inspired me to begin this podcast, beyond, my entire life story. I had the idea for this a couple of years ago, but I wasn't sure if anyone would be interested. And then I discovered the Final Girl Support Group, a novel by Grady Hendrix, and I heard it had been popular, so I thought that might mean there could also be an audience for this podcast. The Final Girls is a brilliant podcast hosted by film critic Anna Bogutskaya, discussing all horror films, not only those with final girls in. I loved her takes on everything, and if you want to listen to someone who actually knows what they're talking about film-wise, check it out. And finally, Tell No One is my favourite podcast of all time. It's a true crime podcast. No, wait, don't run away, it's not awful. It's a true crime podcast, hosted by BFFs Kendall and Annie, who discuss all sorts of cases. The reason I like it is that they both have a hilarious sense of humour, but that humour isn't directed at the victims. And as a survivor of some of the things they cover on the show, I found it really moving to listen to them talk about the perpetrators in really scathing ways. It heals something in me every time they call a serial rapist pathetic. So if you're interested in true crime, but you find a lot of the podcasts in that genre to be too insensitive to listen to, give Tell No One a try. I also mentioned to them that I was thinking of starting this podcast, and they were really encouraging and supportive, which is always great. So, here we are. That's my initial intro. This first episode is airing on the 2026 summer solstice, so of course we're discussing Ari Aster's visual masterpiece Midsommar and its flower-adorned final girl, Dani. Please be aware that there will be spoilers throughout the episode. If you haven't seen Midsommar and you don't know what happens yet, please watch it before listening to this. There's one scene in particular that works so much better when it comes as a horrific surprise. In this episode, I'll be talking about grief, bereavement by suicide, PTSD, bipolar disorder, mental illness stigma, controlling romantic relationships, cults, gang rape, and drugs. Ready? Have a sip of cooling marigold tea, and get ready to dance your way into Midsommar. We first meet Dani when we're rudely pulled out of a lovely folk song being sung over beautiful images of a frozen landscape by a telephone ringing sharply. We see 2 people in bed, Then cut to Dani, who is worriedly calling those people, her parents, for the umpteenth time that evening. She's had a message from her sister, implying that the sister is going to kill their parents and then herself. And then, radio silence. Dani is predictably freaked out. We then meet Dani's boyfriend Christian and 3 of his friends, all of whom will be important to the story. There's Josh, the anthropology PhD student, played by the wonderful William Jackson Harper, Pele, the Swedish dude, and Mark, the resident dickhead. We learn that Christian's friends don't like Dani, and that he's been planning to break up with her for quite a while now. Back to some more exposition about Dani's sister, who has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. For those unfamiliar, this is a type of recurring depression where people go through periods of having unusually high levels of energy and often engaging in risky or erratic behaviour, followed by periods of very low energy when they often are unable to engage with other people and spend a lot of time in bed. If you've seen people online criticising the use of the term bed rotting, it's because it's seen as glorifying this latter type of depression. Because Dani's sister has had these problems for quite a while, people have stopped taking her seriously, and they keep telling Dani not to respond to her sister's urgent-sounding messages because it might, quote, encourage her. This is a real thing people say. However, one of the primary indicators that someone will one day die by suicide is if they have spoken about it many times before. Of course, that doesn't mean it's your responsibility to step in and save them every time, but it does mean that Dani is completely justified in her fear of what might happen. We get a bit more background on Dani and Christian's relationship when it comes out that he's agreed to go to Sweden with his friends for 6 weeks but hasn't told her. The argument is interesting because she ends up apologising to him, even though I think most of us would agree that if you're in a committed relationship, deciding to go away for over a month in 2 weeks' time is the sort of thing you might be expected to tell your partner about first. Their dynamic, as shown by the argument, is not a healthy one, but the unhealthiness is subtle. Nobody is screaming or hitting anything, but there's an undertone of everything being Dani's fault, of her being somehow wrong for having frankly pretty normal needs and requirements of her partner. A short while later, Dani receives a phone call telling her that her sister has killed their parents and then herself. Understandably, she breaks down. Christian now feels that he can't break up with her, and ends up inviting her to Sweden. Whilst Mark is very against this idea, and Josh isn't exactly thrilled about it either, Swedish friend Pele, whose community they're going to visit, seems genuine when he tells her he's pleased she'll be coming with them. So off they all go to Sweden. It's a long drive from the airport to the community. On the way, they stop and take some mushrooms, and Dani has a bad trip during which she falls asleep and dreams about her parents and sister. She sleeps for a long time and wakes up the following day, still lying on the grass. Since it's midsummer in Sweden, the sun has been out the whole time. The group walk to meet the community. An elder greets them. He says welcome to the boys, but welcome home to Dani. There are various ceremonial events, gifts, a meal, and so on. Mark is predictably a douchebag about the whole thing. Dani is, of course, deep in grief, but still tries to go along with the customs. And then comes that scene. Oh my god. I watched this in a cinema, on a big screen. A big screen that showed the splats. What splats, you ask? Oh, the splats the two 72-year-olds make when they jump to their death from a cliff top, landing right in front of the crowd of community members, as well as Dani and her group. The splats are glorious, you guys. Awful, obviously, but so well done. The man doesn't quite die the first time, so people have to manually splat him again with a sledgehammer. Look, if you're into gore, you will adore this scene. I'm not generally a fan, but Ari Aster can make anything look strangely beautiful. Including, apparently, half a face. Dani watches all of these events with a kind of traumatised stare, which I'll talk about more later on. Other non-community members around her, however, are reacting very differently, shouting, retching, yelling at the elders that this is disgusting. Dani walks off on her own after the ceremony. Understandably, she has been deeply affected by it. Pele comes to find her, and he talks about how he too lost his parents at a young age. He says the community could offer her a home, a family. The day after the ceremony, people start disappearing. First Simon, an English bloke who was there as the guest of another community member, and then his girlfriend Connie. Then Mark, good riddance to be honest, and Josh. Dani continues going along with the group's rituals, at times visibly trying to hold herself together, but mostly looking kind of numb. She bakes pies with the women, and the following day she's again sent off with the women of the group, but this time she's given some cooling marigold tea to drink, and then the dancing begins. Every year, we are helpfully informed by a community member, a May Queen is chosen from among the young women at the Midsommar celebration. The May Queen is chosen by means of a dance contest, in which all of them begin dancing, and whoever manages to go the longest wins the title of May Queen. Of course, Dani wins. Immediately, she's surrounded by the community. "Welcome home," they tell her. "We love you." The community holds a meal in Dani's honour. She seems a little dazed. There was definitely something extra in that tea, but nowhere near as dazed as Christian, who can barely find his way to the table. An elder tells Dani that it's tradition for the May Queen to go and bless the crops. "Can Christian come?" she asks. "Nay," comes the reply. So Dani goes and blesses the crops. That seems like quite a nice little ritual. Maybe things will be okay now. Oh no. When they get back, Dani hears suspicious noises coming from one of the buildings. She goes to investigate, and through a crack in the door she sees Christian having sex with a woman, surrounded by many of the other women in the community. All of them are naked. As the audience, we know that Christian is being gang raped here. He has been drugged, and although he agreed to drink the tea and half agreed to maybe have sex with Maya, the main girl who's fucking him, he definitely did not sign up for this weird orgiastic ritual. Dani, understandably, cries and vomits at the sight of this. As the audience, we see Christian at the end of his ceremony, frantically running away from the house, still fully naked. He attempts to shelter in a barn, where he finds the flayed body of Simon hanging from the ceiling, butterfly chicken style. Before he can properly react, he's found by some elders who drug him with some kind of nerve agent, rendering him paralysed. Now Dani, adorned in an array of genuinely beautiful flowers, sits in front of the gathered community. They must make offerings, they explain, and some have already been prepared. However, there is one final space to fill. Dani must choose. Will Christian be sacrificed, or Torbjorn, a man selected at random from the crowd? Dani chooses Christian, who is then sewn into a bearskin. We watch as the community takes the sacrifices to a triangular yellow building. They place them against the walls lining the room, apart from Christian, whom they place on a bale of hay in the centre. Then they set it alight. As the sacrifices start to scream, so do the community members on the outside. Dani walks unsteadily up and down in her giant flower dress, retching and crying. She looks like a huge, beautiful slug. Finally she stops and turns to look at the yellow triangular house as it burns to the ground. As the camera zooms in on her face, she begins to smile. So, the movie has ended with Dani standing with the community. What might her life be like now? There's one interpretation of the film that sees the whole thing as just one massive trip that Dani goes on, and none of it actually happening. I'm going to set that aside for now, because that would have a very different outcome, and I'm just going to take the events in the film as read as if they have actually happened. So now, what happens next partly depends on what Dani decides to do. But there's a bit of a problem with that, which is that Dani isn't really in a place to make any decisions. In the space of a month, she's lost her sister to suicide, her mother and father to parricide, and 4 of her acquaintances to murder by the very people she's now staying with. She's taken a lot of drugs, most of which she was unfamiliar with. She's seen 2 people die by suicide in front of her in a particularly gory fashion, and she's watched as 7 people, 3 alive, 4 dead, burn down to bone, one of whom is her now ex-boyfriend, who she personally sent to that fate. I say she's watched, she's also smelled it. You don't forget the smell of burning human flesh and hair. All of which puts her in a place of extreme vulnerability. The likelihood, certainly in the short term at least, is that she stays with the community. Whether we can call this a choice or not is up for debate. And that is how cults get you. While I was watching Pele talk to Dani about wanting her to stay, about how he too had lost his parents, about how the community could offer her a home and a family, I had an uncomfortable feeling of déjà vu. The cult I grew up in was nothing like the one in Midsommar. It was Christian rather than pagan, and there was no ritual hurling of people off cliffs. However, there were efforts to recruit new members. There was even a weekly meeting in which we learned how to do this. One of the tactics was to look through the obituaries and then put literature through the doors of people whose loved ones had just died. We had booklets called things like "Will I Ever See My Dead Loved Ones Again?" and "Resurrection, the Hope for the Future." They contained invitations to the group's ceremonies. A few days later, we would knock on the doors to see if the people had received these booklets. We would act surprised when they told us they'd recently lost someone, and say something like, "It must be God's will that I visited your house that day." I know, it's sick. If you've lived in the very depths of grief, you will know just how devastating it is. When you lose someone close, especially if it's sudden or particularly horrific, the world disappears, and you're left alone in the thick soup of no more them. If, like Dani, you were the only surviving member of your immediate family, then no one around you will properly be able to connect with your grief. And everyone grieves differently anyway. Even if Dani had had another sibling, they might not have understood each other's reactions. And life has this way of making things happen all at once. Dani didn't only lose her family, which would have been awful enough to begin with, she was also in an unhealthy and difficult romantic relationship. And then Sweden happened. Listening to Cariad Lloyd's Griefcast a few years ago, I remember someone talking about how they had experienced 3 or 4 significant deaths in a row. Some people hadn't even believed them, they said, and nobody else had known how to react. And that's what happens when you go through the level of horror they could make a movie about. Some people just won't believe that you've experienced what you've been through. Others believe it, maybe even were there for part of it, but as the horrors pile on, the people around you step away. Unless you're near a bunch of cult members who step closer. And once Dani had come out of the most acute period of grief, which I imagine would take quite some time, and might be further messed up by the various substances the cult seemed to enjoy, she would find herself living in a community which she knows is willing to murder dissenters. And yet they would be being so lovely to her. They will have provided her with food, shelter, home and family like Pele offered her in the film. Stepping away from them now, the moment she no longer fully needs them, might feel like a betrayal. So, Dani's in the community, she's been there for a while, but she's starting to remember that there's a life outside of all this. Whether this has taken months or years is anyone's guess. Given the amount of sex that happens just during the 9 days when the friends are there, I think it's safe to assume that Dani has also at some point been pregnant and probably given birth. Let's just give her the one baby as a conservative estimate. Pregnancy, of course, brings its own challenges both physically and mentally. Probably this will compound Dani's grief, reopening the wound of her losses and bringing to the surface any grief she thinks she's already dealt with. The idea of becoming a parent often reminds people of their own parents. Working with people who have been inadequately or abusively parented, I'm always struck by how much pregnancy can bring up. Whilst we know nothing about how she was parented, certainly she will be thinking about her parents, probably especially her mother, during this time. We know next to nothing about the sister either, but as far as we can tell she has no children, so if her parents had still been alive, Dani's baby would have been their first grandchild. All of this means that any healing Dani had already managed to do might slip backwards during her pregnancy. So now Dani is stuck with the cult and a baby. And given that she also now has a child who's going to be raised in the cult, the members will probably be watching her quite closely. Some time passes. How long will depend on all sorts of factors. Dani's physical and mental well-being, how much access she has to her child, how much of a hold the cult has on her, and so on. Probably at some point people will come looking for Christian, Josh, Mark, Simon and Connie. But cults are very good at keeping things covered up, and at exercising their religious rights in ways that allow them to conduct all sorts of awful activities that should get the whole lot of them thrown in prison. So back in the US, the 3 boy students with Dani and the 2 English people back in the UK are probably listed as missing. An assumption is made that some kind of accident happened, perhaps the cult even staged this. If so, they're likely to have staged Dani's death as well, and without any family to look for her, who's going to bother? But our girl does have some backbone. She's been through a lot and she's still alive after all. To date, her main defence has been intense dissociation. We can see that through the trauma stare that she does in the cliff jump scene. When the world warps around her and she can barely hear what's going on, but simultaneously she's gripped by the awfulness that she's watching in front of her. Dissociation can be useful, but it can also lead us to stay in a situation that's not good for us. Dissociation basically means being cut off from yourself, and it can take many different forms. If you've ever done anything really difficult where you've gone, just get through it, don't think about what it feels like, you've dissociated. It can be really helpful, for example if you're running a marathon or dealing with an emergency. But in day-to-day situations, it can lead to a lack of control over your own life, which is where Dani has now found herself. Speaking of dissociation, however, this might help Dani to get out and back to the US. Unfortunately, given the child-rearing style of the community, she's probably going to have to leave her kid behind in order to do that. But given that she's already watched her boyfriend be burned alive at her own command, I reckon she's probably got it in her to ignore any feelings she might have about needing to run away without her child. She'd probably justify it to herself by telling herself she'd come back for them one day, although once she's back in her old life, I feel it's more likely that she'd simply switch off those feelings and try to forget about the kid. Presumably, her way back home will involve some kind of hitchhiking to the US Embassy, and then some challenging conversations about where she's been and where her friends are. We already know that Dani has a tendency to take the blame, even when things aren't her fault. And I can imagine her falling into a fawning response to the people looking into her case, and repeatedly apologising for the inconvenience, probably crying a lot. This is interesting, given that she's been so dissociated for so long. But let's remember that whilst in the cult, she's rarely been directly challenged. Mostly, she's just been required to be docile and go along with things. And of course, there are the various substances she's ingested, which she's probably had to try to decrease to give herself a chance of getting out. So by the time she arrives at the embassy, she'd be feeling very weird. Let's say the embassy visit goes as smoothly as possible, and they arrange Dani's safe passage back to the US and allow her to move back into her parents' house. She is, after all, a beautiful young white woman, so although she's had a truly horrific time, there are certain barriers she won't have to face on the way back home. So she's back in the US, living in her parents' old home. What does her life look like now? There isn't really any discussion of the financial setup in the film, but Dani's parents seem neither poor nor super rich. I'd imagine she'd have at least a little inheritance to tide her over, and let's assume the mortgage has been paid off, just to make things easier for our final girl. Even given this leg up, it might be difficult for her to manage. Let's remember that she was still young when she ended up in the cult, and at the time she was in the middle of finishing her thesis, which means she'd probably spent most of her life up to that point having someone else do a lot of the financial management for her. Stepping out of the bright Swedish sunshiny weirdness and back into her old Minnesotan life is bound to have its own weird after effects. Interestingly, Minnesota apparently has the highest percentage of Swedish people living in the US, which maybe explains why the cult is so taken with Dani, and why the elder at the beginning says, "Welcome home." A brief tangent, Dani's surname is Aster, another clue that there's something predetermined about the events of the movie. Aster describes a feeling of passion or ongoing excitement, but it comes from a word meaning to burn. The passion it describes is hot and filled with desire. It seems like no coincidence, then, that Dani's boyfriend burns up in front of her, while she smiles at the excitement she has perhaps found in the discovery of her fucked-up little cult family. Back to Dani in the present. Cults are great at making you feel at home in general, and even more so if you have some kind of historic relationship to them. Now that she's back in Minnesota, in an empty house which is undoubtedly bringing up all her grief about her family again, she's probably second-guessing her decision to return. Does this even feel like home anymore? Probably not. Her friends might have thrown some kind of ill-fated welcome home party, but that will have been too much for Dani, who we know was already prone to anxiety and crying meltdowns before she even got to Sweden. Her old friends, even those who tried to stick around for a while, will probably ultimately back away from the drama and leave her even more isolated. Understandable, but not great for our girl. In amongst all of this, she'll be being questioned by the police about what the hell happened and where the others are. This will be bringing up all sorts of trauma responses, and given her lack of any support system and her general fragility, she's unlikely to be dealing with this robustly. Having someone asking you anything about your deepest traumas is difficult enough even if you've signed up for it, as anyone with PTSD who's been through therapy will be able to tell you. Having law enforcement agents repeatedly interrogate you about it can't be easy at all. Again, the only thing that might give her some degree of relief in this situation is her privilege. Given that she's young, white and pretty, some of the officers might be swayed to treat her more favourably because they've objectified her as some kind of sexy, distressed waif. But this comes with its own problems, not least the fact that she's just escaped from a cult which is very obsessed with sex. That sort of abuse often, not always, but often, results in one of two possibilities: being turned off sex for ages, or becoming hypersexualised. I'm not sure Dani would fit into either of these perfectly, which makes sense because people aren't data, but I can imagine her now ingrained passivity might mean she ends up in situations that do her harm. I mean, just look where she ended up when she went on holiday to Sweden. All of the things we've just spoken about will render Dani susceptible to pretty much anyone who wants to offer her the things she so sorely lacks: a feeling of belonging, of family, of homeliness. She has a house, of course, and I reckon she'd just stay living there rather than sell it and relocate, but she's been isolated by death and trauma from the people she was once close to, and her time in the cult has made her forget how to interact normally with other humans. Not necessarily forget in the literal memory sense, but forget in the embodied sense of how to hold yourself, who speaks when, and so on, which is governed by all kinds of strange social norms. Those norms can be difficult enough to navigate for a lot of us at the best of times, and this is not the best of times for Dani. In the cult, contravening social rules meant punishment, sometimes by death, and so whenever she does accidentally step on a toe, she probably ruminates and feels terrible about it for ages afterwards. What happens ultimately to Dani will of course depend on all sorts of things. Does Pele come and try to find her? What about the elders? Does she willingly return to the cult, in the way so many people do, because it's the closest thing to comfort she can find? Perhaps. If none of those things happen, then in my opinion Dani would be ripe for any kind of weird alternative bullshit that comes her way. Probably the first dodgy yoga juice cleanse anti-vaxxer who shows up will be someone she'll imprint on in relief and follow them into the madness. Given her proclivity for going along with rituals, she could end up in any kind of group, although I'd imagine she'd be most likely to go for something with pseudo-natural vibes, communal life and a vague but persistent spirituality. So, our girl leaves one cult, can't cope with life, and joins another. Bleak? Yeah. Realistic? Also yeah. Is it possible her life could go another way? Sure. People escape terrible situations and build better lives all the time. But this is how I see Dani's life most likely playing out, given her history and the way she tends to respond to trauma. What do you think? Midsommar was directed by Ari Aster and came out in 2019. Our final girl Dani was played beautifully by Florence Pugh. You can follow the podcast on Instagram @ThatFinalGirlLife, on Patreon, ThatFinalGirlLife, or send an email to thatfinalgirllife@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember, the horrors persist, but so do we.